Okay, David K., thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time. Before we jump into sort of the topics that we had outlined, maybe you could give a brief introduction of yourself. I think we met maybe 15 or so years ago, but I know you were doing stuff even a long time before that. So I'm super thrilled to have your wisdom poured out over the next 90 minutes, but maybe you can give that intro first.
Sure. And I'm going to start off just by doing a self-own because, or I guess I should say own goal, given what's just been happening around us. When we talked about doing this, you'd sent an invitation for this conversation, which was great. I assumed it was an invitation to talk about what we were going to talk about.
Oh.
Now, fortunately, LinkedIn helped because I saw, and I'm going to be talking on Monday with David K. And I'm like, oh no, we're actually doing this. So we're actually doing this. That's great. Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I've really enjoyed everything that we've done together for the last 15 years. My cat Jade is also very happy to be part of this. She always knows when it's an important audience and makes her presence known. I've been doing knowledge management for a very long time. As principal of DBK and Associates, I've been doing this work for, we just hit our 20th anniversary a couple of weeks ago. So been doing this for quite a while. Prior to that, I was at a self-service search engine vendor. You may be a little familiar with the space, and I think we did some work together there too. And you know, what I learned from that was that, you know, we had some customers who were really successful with that search engine and with self-service. We had some customers who were spectacularly unsuccessful, like long flaming trench in the ground, unsuccessful with that stuff. And we saw people who were using technology that I knew was nowhere near as like powerful. And some of them were doing just fine. So, you know, this thing that I'd been hearing for years and years before that about people, process, and technology, I'd been very focused on the technology piece as a technologist, and of course that is important. But it really landed that what people are doing and what they're thinking about as they're doing it is really what's important. And they're really what drives things. So, you know, knowledge is kind of a through theme in my career, even though I didn't really kind of realize it at the time. I started out in the intelligence community, making tools for intelligence analysts. And back in the days when email wasn't really a thing, they were getting swamped with hundreds of cables from, you know, around the world. And they had to kind of make sense of what was going on. They had to organize their thoughts and structure. They had to be able to collaborate. And so building those two tools for intelligence analysts was knowledge management, although I didn't know enough to give it that name at the time. Also took as part of a, you know, when the Berlin Wall came down and we had to take some of the work that we'd done and apply it in different areas, we actually found that some of the search technology that we'd built for intelligence analysts worked great for librarians, library scientists. So that's when I, you know, did my turn with the American Library Association, Special Libraries Association, got to visit beautiful university libraries around the country and, you know, help these people manage their knowledge because, you know, it was the time when things were moving from paper journals to all of this wonderful stuff being available online. But it was pre-web, so different formats, different places, right? It was, you had to log in here and log in there, and some of the logins, you know, you'd be paying $100 an hour to be attached to, and so trying to make that all as efficient and useful as possible.
Awesome.
So I've done other stuff, but that has been, you know, knowledge is really kind of almost by accident been the thing that's been consistent throughout.
Yeah, it's interesting. That seems to be a recurring theme with the people that I know and have interviewed is we kind of fell into this by accident, but it certainly is something that we all love. So that was awesome, because I was going to ask you to elaborate, if you didn't already, on your LinkedIn tagline is KM consultant for customer support, but you're so much more than that. And we're only 5 minutes in, and even I learned something new about you. I was not aware of the intelligence stuff that you did. And so, John Schmay actually covered that topic of the difficulties of sharing knowledge before the internet. We were talking about, once you ship the CD-ROM, it's pretty hard to make the incremental update. And obviously we live in a totally different world now. Maybe give just a little bit of context around, one of the areas that I know you consult with a lot is around KCS.
Right. So KCS is the industry best practice for, while you're actually doing the work, capturing new knowledge if you need to, most of the time reusing existing knowledge, updating it, keeping it fresh if that's appropriate. And it is something that this business, this last 20 years, I've really been focused on, because it works. And that's, it's, I used to go to KM World, Knowledge Management World in DC, and I think it happens every November. And these things were really depressing, right? Because you'd have somebody come up, say, well, we set up a SharePoint and we ask everybody to put data inside the SharePoint. And they did for a while, but the experts who put the data in didn't right away in a way that the people who needed the information could use, and then stuff got out of date and nobody could find anything. And, they started weeping and getting led gently off stage, right? That it was one of these after another. And I wanted to say, I know how to fix this. We've got this practice. Yeah, it came from customer support, but it's for so much more than that. And now I need to revisit my LinkedIn tag. It's always the marketing question about how specific do you want to be, as opposed to how open do you want to be. And I think I overshot one way based on what you're telling me. But I wanted to say, we know how to capture knowledge in a way that is relevant to the customer. We know how to keep it up to date. We know how to make it really findable and usable. And all of that came from KCS. And so, that has been a big piece of my life. And I find that, I was working with a research and development group, like way out there, fundamental science, more research turning into development, we hope, right? And it turned out that, they weren't handling paces. They weren't doing any of the standard things you'd find in a KCS implementation. And yet the principals really let me help them do a better job of sharing, this fundamental research that they're doing. So it's really broadly applicable, has been my experience.
Awesome. Well, we just proved that this podcast is not sponsored by KM World. Although I've had similar experiences at different conferences with knowledge management. And ironically, that is sort of the state of mind I found myself in when we first met. I think you did the first KCS project I'd ever been exposed to. And so much so that, we always joke that I went to the first team meeting and it was awesome, but it was also snowing outside at a Ritz-Carlton at Beaver Creek. So it was like blending my two loves together of not wasting time at work with knowledge management projects that are doomed to fail, which, Ragsdale just in a conference last week talked about the sad statistics of how many do fail, certainly within 2 years, versus, you sort of opened my eyes to a way in which it can start small and be agile and, iteratively change as the needs go on. And that was definitely not the SharePoint example that I had, for example, at a bank that I worked for. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about, I've covered a lot of different topics around KCS already, but one area that I know you're passionate about that we haven't talked about yet is sort of that evolve loop. And I've seen you do a lot of work with that, but maybe you can start off by giving the, definition of it. And then I'd love to hear, what does a day in the life of, your consulting practice look like with that? What challenges do you see? What successes, that sort of thing?
Sure. Although I have to start off by taking a side path, since you mentioned skiing and Agile. As you probably know, that's how Agile started, was in a ski lodge, a bunch of people getting together. And one of the things that has been really interesting to me in recent years, as I've learned more about Agile, is just how much Agile and KCS have in common, right? I think
Yeah.
that if I'm dealing with somebody who's not right in this space, I'll kind of say it's agile knowledge management, right?
Yeah.
And there's just a huge amount in common. Agile's famous. KCS started first, but it was a case of parallel evolution at a ski lodge. So there you go. In KCS, we talk about the solve loop and the evolve loop, and so it's a double loop process. And what a process geek would tell you is that the solve loop, generically called the A loop, is the process that you do over and over again. So in KCS, we do the solve loop every time we're working a case or an incident or a ticket where knowledge is relevant. Anytime we're answering a question, replying to an email where knowledge is relevant. In all of those cases, we're going to be doing the solve loop. And that really comprises what I mentioned in the introduction to KCS. We're going to, capture what we hear from the customer, or if we end up needing to contribute that to the knowledge base, we'll do so in a very usable, quick, easy, crisp structure. Most of the time, we'll be reusing content and we'll improve it if we need it. So that's the solve loop, and it keeps on going. But the thing that makes a double loop process different is that you have what's generically called the B loop. In KCS, we call it the evolve loop. And that's the continuous improvement loop, right?
Mhm.
That's how we make the evolve loop, is how we make the solve loop work better. And so if I'm doing a KCS workshop, I may spend 30 minutes really focused on the solve loop, and most of the rest of the time focused on the evolve loop, because that's the lifting organizations need to do. One piece of the evolve loop is content health, and part of that is doing value-added content work or knowledge work. We go through the workshop, and we design our practices and think about it and talk about it and stuff. But then what generally happens later is we launch the solve loop, and it's a big change management initiative. We're changing how people are doing their jobs, as I said, how they're thinking about it. And it's really easy just to drill in on that, to focus in on the solve loop to the exclusion of everything else.
Yeah.
I think that's actually kind of appropriate for a while. But after a year or a year and a half, or maybe 2 years, depending on how long it takes to get, our friend Brad Smith calls KCS a 10,000-pound flywheel, right? Because you've got to push it hard to get it going. Once it gets going, it has an awful lot of momentum. Now, you still have to keep pushing it, or it'll eventually grind to a halt. But so once you've got that flywheel really going, I think that's the time to really focus in on the evolve loop. And when I started doing KCS, these years ago, we said things like, you should have some knowledge domain experts, and they should have some time to make some content better based on the data that they see.
Yeah.
They're smart people, they'll figure it out, right? And I think this is the challenge of having people who are Myers-Briggs ends, or like John Schmay, working on inventing practices. They're smart people, they'll figure it out. We've laid out the general principles. So it turns out that people said, yeah, evolve loop. And then it sort of, in most cases, really didn't happen.
Yeah, that's my experience.
And so I really have to, hats off in true Consortium for Service Innovation fashion. There have been a lot of people who've contributed to this, but I want to particularly recognize a gentleman named Peter Case, who worked for PTC. I haven't caught up with him recently, but Peter was in charge of their knowledge domain analysis program, and he really built some structure around it. And we now have a practices guide for how to do knowledge domain analysis. We have training that we'll talk about, hands-on, let's do it together kind of training for doing knowledge domain analysis. But really the genesis of all of that, the seed that was planted, was in Peter saying we should put some structure around this. And so that's how we really, I think, started modern knowledge domain analysis.
Okay. And how long ago was that?
I'm at that age now where I always assume it was closer than it really was. It was probably 7 years ago at this point.
Okay.
It was at a member summit, and it wasn't even like a full session. It was, we were breaking into tracks, and I was just blown away. And, we haven't looked back.
Awesome. No, I've seen a lot of that where you talked about, the initial focus being on the solve, because, you're doing a technology deployment, or you're just launching KCS on your existing technology. And, there's, like you said, there's a lot of change management. Varying positions I've been in within my career, whether that was in implementation services, where all I got to see was that initial view, or in certain sales roles where, I'm only around for the first couple months after go live, versus I've really enjoyed in other roles where I have gotten to see them circle back to the B loop. And especially when somebody like yourself is assisting with that. I love the analogy because it is something that takes a lot of pushing. But once I've seen it going at an organization, you like you say, you just kind of have to lean over and give it a little kick every now and then. Otherwise it works very well. So what are some of the gotchas you've seen specifically for organizations that, try to make that pivot, but just get hung up on it and don't end up focusing enough on it?
Well, I think don't end up focusing enough on it really is the message. I think, the organizations that try and do that pivot and add in evolve loop work, I think, we know enough about how to do it. And there is so much low-hanging fruit in terms of the benefit that, like, almost any way you try to do it, you're going to get some big benefit out of it. I in my experience, people aren't thinking about it.
Yeah.
Right. And because, and it's understandable, right? We live, particularly in service and support, we live in an urgent environment, right? There's always the tyranny of the urgent, and there are always things to do to give that flywheel a little kick. And so it's really easy to focus there and just not think about it. So I think step one, this is the good news. Step one is just realizing, hey, we've got some good knowledge now. We've got some good, not perfect, but good practices. We're seeing benefit. How can we really dial that up and ramp that up?
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the clients I've worked with on this, it comes out of a typical question of, you look at some analytics and some technology platform, you see some good, you see some bad. What are we going to do about the bad? And having that pointer to, this process, like you talked about, gives an immediate, action that even an executive sponsor can easily support, right? You're telling me you're going to make bad good, go do it.
And just to be a little bit contrarian, it's a little bit like strengths-based leadership. KDA is not always about making the bad good, but making the good great. And let me say more about that. One of the things that is truly incredible and universal in every knowledge program that I've been involved in where they track the data is how skewed knowledge use is, whether it's page views in a self-service site, whether it's, internal reuse. The short head of content, a little tiny bit of content, often like 1% or 3%, can represent half of the use of the knowledge. Right. And then you have a very long tail of content that's, equally important in aggregate, but is used individually very infrequently. That's not a bad thing. That just is the way reality seems to be structured.
Uh-huh.
So the nice thing about knowledge domain analysis and why there's so much low-hanging fruit is that if you look at that very short head, the content that is used over and over and over again, small improvements in that content or small improvements in the customer experience that led to that content being so popular, right, can make a tremendous difference in your customer experience, in financially, in making the work of the people delivering service and support or answering questions more rewarding.
Yeah.
Right.
Great
So
point.
there's a big leverage point.
And what about technology? One of the things I've been trying to focus on this is having some discussion around, how much is technology based, and then how much doesn't matter, what technology you have. I mean, similar to your statement before, I'm probably going to recall that this was not quite as long ago as it actually was, but I remember you had like a wiki that anybody, could use. It was just an open source thing. So it sort of eliminated the excuse of, well, we don't have money or time to implement technology. And I loved it because it quickly got people to the, rolling up their sleeves and working on the process work. But specific to, this, topic of the B loop, maybe talk to me a little bit about what leverages technology and what does not.
So the big piece of this is making sure that you have the information you need. And, when we met, and I'm imagining us having the discussion of, what life would be like at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And I don't think either of us ever would have imagined the fact that people still had a hard time getting the data they needed to run their program out of their technology, right? And yet that seems to be the world that we live in. So that I think that the core foundation of technology is being able to get the data you need to do this, right? To see what's the short head of content and how often it's getting used and what people are doing in self-service and doing the kind of query analysis to know what things they're asking about that they may never have opened a case about, right? And so there's certainly bright spots in that, not that we're going to plump for your current company, but that's an area that my clients say they really value, particularly around the self-service analysis about Coveo, but and other tools. We're technology agnostic. But it's often the case that people struggle to get that data.
Yeah.
Now,
I do feel like one great thing about the whole, SaaS movement and customer success and business outcomes and all that, which, frankly, we should have all been doing in the first place. But it's driven a lot of platforms, in my observation, to have better analytics, right? Because the executive sponsor is demanding it. So to your point, it makes it a lot easier to see where you can spend your time more efficiently.
So when I do a knowledge domain analysis workshop, I go like really old school on it, and I'll take whatever data I can get from our client, and Jennifer and I will put it into a spreadsheet that's designed for analysis. So for the analysis work, Excel works, or, Google Sheets or what it works. What we've seen some folks do is really invest, and I don't think this comes out of the box with any tool you can buy, but we've seen people invest in tools that are specific for knowledge domain analysis, for knowledge domain experts and content specialists to do their work that helps you visualize. So imagine, for example, a plot that shows content based on one dimension, how often it's been viewed in self-service, and in another dimension, how often it's reused to close cases, right? And maybe having some kind of color coding or heat mapping on that dot
Yeah.
to tell you what kind of customer feedback is. So, for example, the consortium, once again, PTC has shown off a tool that does these kinds of things. And you can just, most articles are going to be very close to the origin, right? Because the long tail, they're just not used that much in any way, and that's great. But some of the articles will be way out there. And these are to the point of addressing the bad. If they're way out there in red, well, then we have real work to do.
Yeah.
If they're way out there and, happy and green, then we can look at potential improvement. Maybe they're used a lot. I had this happen at a client. An article was used a lot. 2 articles actually were used a lot internally, but they were almost never used in self-service. Head scratcher, right? So looked at the articles, and one of them was, how do you do a manual uninstall of this mission critical enterprise stuff? By the time you're doing a manual uninstall of mission critical enterprise stuff, things have probably gone pretty pear-shaped, right?
Yeah.
And so you probably want to have an engineer with you working on that. So it's not surprising that maybe is not the biggest driver of self-service.
Yeah.
The other article was pure technical gobbledygook, right? It was clear tier 3 stream of consciousness, great information in there, but absolutely unconsumable. And that's where a little bit of work in the Evolve loop to take this great information and put it out in a way that customers could really use and take advantage of. And then we want to see the use of that internally, the number of cases associated with that drop like a rock, right?
Yeah.
Because that tells us that people are taking advantage of the self-service. So anyhow, by having some visualization capability around that, you can do this, but I've seen plenty of organizations harvest a lot of value just by something as simple as Excel.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And maybe switching topics a little bit, you and I had talked about case deflection. And since you mentioned, pushing stuff out to self-service, I've really enjoyed watching the work that you've done in this space, because that was a very simple and easy to understand explanation. But those are the types of actions that are required to get self-service improvements, right? To get beyond that plateau. And everybody I talk to always wants to know, how do we improve case deflection? And it's like, well, first you got to measure it, then you got to be prepared to do these types of activities. So you've got a pretty interesting measurement formula that I know you've used with clients over the years. I don't know if you're prepared to show that or walk us through it maybe as a start, and then just talk about why you developed that formula and the general strategies you leverage with clients to make those improvements.
Great. So I'll tell you right away why I've been working on this formula for so long. And it's because I worked for a self-service vendor, right?
Yeah.
And literally the way that we got paid, it turns out this was a terrible idea, but the way that we got paid was, basically based on successful interactions. And a big part of that was deflection. So back then in the late 90s, we would hear vendors come up and say, oh yeah, every time somebody opens a document, you've deflected a case. Yeah. Yay, right? Look how much we're saving billions of dollars. And of course that didn't pass the smell test at all. And there were a lot of other bits of kind of pernicious happy thought, magic thinking about deflection, that like, okay, somebody looks in an article and they don't open a case in 48 hours, then it's a deflection. No, most people, when you go out to Google and you find something on YouTube that shows you how to change the air filter in your car, right? The cabin filter, it's not, you weren't going to call the car company. You weren't going to take the car in for service, right? If you hadn't figured that out, it's just, okay, nice. I've got a little bit of help. So that's generally what's going on with when people are doing things in self-service. So that was the motivation, was to really be able to speak to people in a credible way, in a way that I would feel comfortable standing in front of a CFO and explaining, to estimate deflection. I say estimate rather than measure, because you can't measure something that didn't happen, right? An estimate is really the best you can do. So we looked at, how people were using systems and what was going on in the world. And, some of our clients had an amazing ramp up in self-service. And so deflection is one thing to think about. I think stepping back, something that is just as important to think about is, why are we doing self-service in the first place? Deflection's part of it, but right. I mean, I often will ask people in a workshop, like, why does your organization exist? Why do you get paid a salary, right? And you and your colleagues. And often the answers that I'll get are something like, well, our software has bugs, or, users run into problems, or all true. But I'm like, yeah, but you've got their money, right? What's it to you, right? We're not altruists here. I mean, and the answer is, of course, well, in SaaS in particular, we have their money now, but we may not have their money next quarter or next year. And when they merge with another company, this technology may not be the one that gets deployed across the new enterprise. And, we want our customers to be, talking with other executives on the golf course and saying, man, you really ought to look at this, right? So it's all about customers receiving and perceiving value from the product. And so, and we can do that great by answering questions and closing cases, but we can do an awful lot more, like an order of magnitude or more of that through self-service and other, and bots and other unassisted channels. So the context for this is that all self-service success is good. Deflection is a kind that you can monetize. And so I appreciate why it's important too. But to actually get to showing some stuff, would you be able to let me share my screen, or
let's see,
or share my screen for me? I don't know if you can do that.
I'm just going to make you the host. That'll be the easiest.
All right, good. I promise not to do anything too awful. All right.
Oh, and can you tell us what kind of cars these are? Because this is one thing I've followed you over the years as well.
Yes, this is called a Spec Racer Ford, and SRF Generation 3. And they are fun little cars. They're not, people always ask, how fast do they go? Like 120, right? They're not at the end of the front straight. They're not fast cars. But then at the turn at the end of the front straight, we're going through and hitting the apex at 93 miles an hour. So they corner really, really well, like 1.6 Gs or something like that. But the fun thing about this class is all the cars are identical. Basically, all you can change is the alignment, right? You can change the suspension settings, but and it's a very humbling experience, because you cannot spend your way to the front of the pack with these cars. And I should add, I am very rarely near the front of the pack in these cars, but all throughout the grid, anywhere in the top 10 or beyond, there's some really great racing going on. As you can see, we're all pretty close here. So yeah, thanks. Screensaver always makes me happy when I see it. So, just to kind of get about how I approach the idea of deflection, I should say, like Agile and KCS, this was independently developed by other folks, starting with Oracle. So this is not a stroke of lone genius, and I feel very reassured by that I'm not making stuff up. But the way I think about it first is, let's look at our interactions with customers visually. So there are going to be a lot of customers when they have an issue or want to know how to do something or have a question, that are going to go to self-service. And we all know that, in our lives, generally the first place we go is Google. We may log into a to a vendor's website if we're a customer and we have access to that, and then we can get maybe some more advanced search tools. But there'll be a group of people that will try and solve it on their own first, because really, who wants to open a case nowadays? The same John Ragsdale you mentioned in other bit of research, he did an analysis or reported on an analysis of how people want to get help. And of course, Google was number one.
Yeah.
Logging in vendor website was very high, and opening a case was like number 12 or number 13, right? It was really so. But there are sometimes when you want to do that. Maybe it's maybe you're just really comfortable with getting on the phone and talking to people that you talked with for the last several decades. Maybe there's a real high severity issue that you can't sit around on your computer trying to resolve. You really need to connect with an organization. So there'll be some number of interactions where they're going to try and contact you in an assisted channel directly first. Now, of the people who try self-service, there really are two groups. There are those who, if they don't get the answer they need, they really need to get this answer. They really need to get this fixed. So they're going to escalate. They're going to open up a case eventually if they have to. They'd rather not, but if they have to, they will. And then there's everybody else, the majority, generally the vast majority of people who are trying self-service. If they don't get the answer they need, well, that's a bummer. But they're not going to open a case. And what that really leads to is a picture like this. Some of the people who go to your website will be successful, or some people who try self-service will be successful, others won't. And now if we combine these two factors, now we get something really interesting. They're the people who tried self-service first, but weren't going to open up a case. If they don't get the answer they need, they're sad. They're not getting the value they expect to or want to from your product. But that's where it ends.
Yeah.
Similarly, there are people who are successful. They get the answer they wanted, need. They weren't going to have opened a case, but because you've been able to help them in this highly scalable, highly efficient way, they're happy campers, right? They did get the value they were hoping for, or perhaps even more. But it's that would escalate place where things get interesting. Now, of course, if people were going to escalate, if they didn't get their answer, and they didn't get their answer, well, they're going to escalate, right? And so you can see those. And then the people who were going to escalate but didn't need to, well, those are your estimated deflections, right? And there's also a case where if people come in and they try and contact you first, they try and open a case or whatever, and you offer them relevant knowledge in the process of submitting a case. Often people give you better search strings when they think they're talking to a human than when they think they're talking to a search engine. Then you have the opportunity to de-escalate. Different people call this different, last chance things, but you get an opportunity to say, I know they were going to contact first, but they didn't have to, which is good news all around. So what you end up with is, people who were able to do self-service, ideally more than the people who started there. And then, including the people whose intent to contact was deflected. And then we have the actual escalations going into the contact center. So from the visual math, you can see that the math looks easy. If you knew how often people were successful, and if you knew how often people were going to escalate, and we're assuming that those are unrelated, which seems well borne out, then we're able to generate all of these numbers. But then the question is, how are you going to get a measure of success, right? So industry research that we've seen, this has held remarkably constant over the years, kind of surprisingly, is that something like 40 to 60% of people who attempt self-service get an answer. You may have newer or better data, but that's
same.
Yeah. Okay, great. That's actually good to hear. So, I mean, on one hand, that sounds like awful. On the other hand, if you think about a batting average and that every self-service interaction is, free on the margin, that's a lot better than nothing.
Yeah.
So if we want to figure out, though, better than, well, it's probably between 40 and 60%, and you're not going to be far wrong. One thing, you can just put a survey right on the solution. Did this article help you? But I think, as we all know, you get a tiny response rate from that, which means the non-response bias makes this not possible to be extrapolated, right? People say, did this article help you? Yes or no. Generally, when they're either surprisingly happy or they're very unhappy, right?
Yeah.
So we don't know about the middle. We can do surveys when people, either leave the website or leave the article. I know when Oracle did this, they actually asked people to opt in at the beginning, which meant that they had a better response rate for the people who'd opted in, which is great. So you still have some issue with non-response. You still have some customer experience issues, but we've seen that work. But then, the people on the phone actually can gather some of this data. And you can just go out and call your customers and ask them, or connect with your, I know it's so 2020 to call, but you can go out and meet them somehow and reach out to them and find out if they were successful. There's also some work you can do with clickstream analysis. I would put that more in kind of, graduate level, and you need to have some fairly sophisticated tooling to do this, but and it's not going to be perfect, but none of these methods is perfect. So that's exciting. If you talk to people about their most recent interaction, and just get them to focus on that interaction, and get them to identify their goal. I mean, nobody surfs the web, right? People are looking at self-service content for a reason. That reason may just be learning about something rather than a problem they have to solve or something they're trying to do, but they come for a reason. And then ask them, were they successful in doing whatever they came to do? And if they say they were successful, you could say, would you have opened a case if you hadn't been successful? I don't know how useful this is, because when we do this analysis, people kind of exaggerate. They say, oh, yes, definitely would have opened a case. Whereas if you ask, if you weren't successful, what did you do next? Did you open a case next? Most of the time, the answer is no, right? 90% of the time, the answer is, I lived with it. I asked a friend, I checked the documentation, right? Mostly I just lived with it. So, and that gets you the escalation rate. So with this, you get both success and escalation, which allows you to do that visual math, or in the non-visual math, actual math, we're saying that deflection can be calculated as the number of self-service sessions you have, how many of those were successful, and how many of those people would have escalated. So it's really just that little rectangle that we had at the bottom right above the line. You can also, with a little bit of algebra too, you can figure out that if people asked, if you have the people who are helping customers ask some sample of them, did you try and self-serve first? You can back into the same numbers.
Okay.
A funny thing about this, my son just came home for the holidays. It's always wonderful to see him. But when he was a kid who was doing algebra, he actually saw me working on this lower formula at one point. And he looked carefully. He said, "You mean people actually use that?" So there you go.
Yeah. Um, what about general self-service success? So, you just walked us through a formula for the deflection, but you talked about, which I absolutely agree with, that self-service is so much more than that. What sort of measurement strategies do you have in place for that? Because for me personally, I'm the typical example you gave of, I don't want to call in, I'll just live with it. Or, these days, whether it's software or, I was dealing with a action camera, right? I'm like, I'm just tired of it. I'll just try the other one, and I'll sell the old one. So it's
Wow.
easy just to switch vendors versus I'm usually going to a site not with the anticipation that they will actually solve a problem, but more of like, help me use this thing better, help me like it better, that sort of thing. So maybe walk us through what you've done with some of your clients recently on just general self-service success and measuring that.
Well, the good news is that, the same sort of techniques that help you get the success rate for a deflection estimation also get you there for just overall success. Your story reminds me of this fantastic book, strong recommendation, and I hope I get the title right, but it's something like Badass Making Your Users Awesome by Kathy Sierra. And she talks about exactly what you're saying, where people become loyal to a brand when they feel proud of the things that they can do with that
Yeah.
brand, right? Like we're thinking about you and your cameras, right? I don't know whether you're a Canon person or a Nikon person. I don't know much about photography. There seems to be a big divide there, but people gravitate to whatever brand they gravitate to
Yeah.
because of the results they get.
Yeah. And that's a great example. It's not that, so I happen to be Canon. I just kind of fell into it, but I don't switch because I've learned how to use the Canon system, the menus, the buttons, and that sort of thing. And it's not that Canon has less defects than another company, but they have taught me how to use their ecosystem. So why would I want to switch? Versus if they hadn't have taught me that, the minute I encounter, better specs or whatever, I could just go swap it out.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why, you said we should have been doing this stuff long ago, referring to success and other things. I think, the fact that customer success organizations need to exist is almost an indictment
Yeah.
of the way that we've been doing business
Yeah.
so long, because we should be in that business. I think looking at self-service through the lens of customer success and customer value really maybe changes the kind of work that you do there, right? Sure, in tech and in IT service management, we're going to be like really focused on break fix because we see a lot of that. But let's focus on making users awesome. Let's
Yeah.
focus on making people so successful with our stuff that why would they even think about going somewhere else? And that kind of content is different. It often requires a degree of business acumen or business awareness, being able to understand not just the bits and bytes, but what people are really trying to accomplish with our software, and barriers that may have nothing, or systems or whatever, barriers that may have nothing to do with our products that are still getting in the way of their being successful.
Yeah.
Or using it in a way that is easy and makes them happier.
Yeah.
Without naming any vendor names, there was a vendor that did accounting software generally, and they interviewed a bookkeeper who was using their software, and they watched her do a month-end close that was just she got the right answer, but the way she did it was grotesquely inefficient. And
Yeah.
it took a day and a half to what should have taken an hour. And at some point, some empathetic soul interviewing her asked, "When's the last time you took a vacation?" And she started crying. And so thinking about how can we get her to be able to take a
Yeah.
vacation because we've helped her be successful, not just, in getting the right answer, but doing it in a way that's, satisfying and delivers a feeling of accomplishment and is not painful.
So that somewhat leads me into the question I wanted to ask you about, going back to general self-service success. Now that you've measured it, how do you help clients sell the importance of it to executives? Because I think those of us that have been in the industry, we realize the importance of that, but it's hard to go to somebody and say, okay, over here on this report is, explicit costs we prevented from coming into this very expensive call center. And then on this other report, and then they're like, hold on, wait, tell me more about that first report. They don't want to, and yet it's so counterintuitive, because if I had to summarize one focus of business over the last, several decades, it's been all about making the employees more efficient. And so your example of, giving that lady some time on her hands, and yet that's the type of enablement we need to do, the general self-service success. She never thought she had a problem, right? We need to push more proactively that adopting content to her. So how do you get executive sponsors all the way up to a CFO, right, to prioritize that?
So first, we both know this is hard, right? And that we have trained leaders in contact centers and support and ITSM. We've trained leaders to be kind of all about the numbers, and those numbers are typically case or incident numbers. The case is the currency. And so making that shift is difficult and a long range thing. So I think, we need to meet people where they're at. I know I have industry colleagues who disagree with me on this, but I think we should talk about deflection. I think we should, get their interests. The thing to me, though, that really helps now is the fact that we do have customer success organizations.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, you might have a support executive go to the CFO and say, if you give me so many dollars, I can avoid this many conversations with customers. And then the next day, the executive in charge of success says, well, if you give me this much money, I can have this many more conversations with customers. Right? It's a little bit nuts. So I think, talking about our ability to do just what we've been talking about and make customers successful and feel good about it is, and help them really understand the value that our products can give them. It's a lot easier to talk about in a time when we have success. They're really doing the same thing, and we want to be tied together, I think, in this initiative, and in this goal. So rather than saying, okay, deflections, great, we save some money, but there are all these other things you've asked us to do over the years in terms of making customers successful. And customers on executive level loyalty surveys are telling us that we're not responsive enough when they have a really big issue, or we don't, we kind of brush them off. Well, if by having some of these redundant, repetitive things that people are just as glad to self-serve on their own, taking them out of the caseload, if we can then get people to, have the time to make those folks really successful when they do need to open a case, that's great. I was working with a client that, got some really pretty, they have a short head of clients, right? Their largest clients represent a lot of their business. And so they did a really in-depth survey and analysis of kind of the temperature of those clients. And there were some, and it was not an insignificant number, who were really frustrated with the support experiences that they were having. And, to the extent that these look like a churn risk of some enormous customers. And the CFO certainly doesn't want that. So if we can self-serve a lot of the routine stuff, and then be able to focus on the things that are turning these accounts red, right?
Yeah.
That's a big win too. So I
Yeah.
think that's how we get there from efficiency, just dollars and cents, to customer success and making
Yeah.
customers, yeah,
I love your
see the value.
story of how one person's trying to eliminate customer conversations and the other leader is trying to have more. And I've always looked at it similar to how you described of let's eliminate the conversations that the customer doesn't need us to be involved with, right? Like, here's how to reset your password. All we're going to do is read off the article to you. You're actually going to do it and then free up the time for anybody in the organization, whether it's support or otherwise, to have those more intelligent conversations. I mean, one of the ways in which I've seen the general self-service success work well is I had a client, pretty large, Fortune 100, maybe even, larger than that, but I'll be conservative. Going through, this is like 8 or 9 years ago, the typical, on-prem to SaaS migration. How are we going to talk, these people into, wanting to do the monthly thing rather than just spend every 8 years or whatever it is. And we actually got knowledge placed in the product. And you could see a very clear difference on 2 things, really. One is, let's just say we have 3 of the 12 products deployed within product knowledge. All of a sudden, those 3 are getting used a lot more because people are finding features, that they didn't even know existed or whatnot. And then we kind of did some, a double click into that and saw, and this is oversimplified explanation, but what is the product usage as a ratio to their knowledge consumption? And it was obviously much higher. And then you take all of that and you find that, well, of course, these people that are consuming more knowledge and thus using the product more are not only less concerned about the new subscription model, because they're like, wow, look at all these features that I don't have to wait 8 years for. They're also obviously much more likely to renew. This was also a company that has a lot of ancillary products that were pretty easy to cross-sell if you kind of showed them, the value of. And so it was really interesting. We were showing people the ceiling at which this product would no longer satisfy their needs, and they needed to spend a fairly substantial amount of money to buy the second product, but they were happy to do it because they had accomplished so much more than they ever thought possible with product X. So you're telling me product Y can do that and more. And so it's a really interesting, use case of that, but, not everybody has that exact scenario where they can walk into the executive team and show them, and so I'm just always looking for ways to do that. And I appreciate you sharing that. Maybe if you have time for just one other sort of major topic, I know intelligent swarming is something that, is getting more and more discussion recently. Give me your opinion on, what intelligent swarming is, what it isn't, and where you see, organizations finding the most success versus, thinking they're going to do it, and then they have that failure that we talked about earlier.
Right. Well, intelligent swarming is a way of organizing how the work gets done in a more collaborative way. So, a historical artifact, particularly of support and customer care, is that we have organized ourselves into these tiers, right? So we've got the frontline people who are good at fixing the customer, right? And then we got tier 2, more product expertise, tier 3, deep product expertise, maybe not people that you want customers to talk with all the time, right? And so the customer experience of this is, of getting passed along from person to person. And you and I've talked a lot about the effortless experience over the years. And, we know, and just intuitively, nobody likes to get bounced from person to person, and, to retell their story. So swarming is a model that says, hey, rather than just living with this kind of legacy way of organizing ourselves, let's try and get issues to the person who's most likely to be able to deal with them the first time. And often that's going to be the generalists who would have been tier 1 people. Sometimes it's, people who would have been tier 2 or tier 3 people, because we can identify that this issue actually, needs deep product expertise, or it needs some tools and capability that these product specialists will have that the generalists might not have access to, or might not be able to do. And so we try and get the case to the right person, or I should really say to the right group of people.
Yeah.
And this is where the mindset shift starts to come in, because typically we've been assigning cases or issues to people. And fundamentally, that comes from a lack of trust in many cases, right? If we don't, tell you, here's the next case you're going to work on, people will cherry pick the queue, as people like to say, and, just do the easy one. I'm a little skeptical that in an environment where metrics are set up properly, that's going to happen, but swarming explicitly rejects that. And so we're going to expose it to the people who are most likely to be able to help. And those folks are going to make a determination about when they want to work on. And then when they do that, if it turns out, and generally they don't need help, but if it turns out they do need help, they don't toss the case over the wall to somebody else to help and, restart the clock with the customer. Basically, they pull in the people that they need. And, at some point, when you talk to organizations about this, there's, whoa, that's a really big change. I don't know about that. But when you look at what's actually happening, maybe it's not such a big change, right? When people contribute to communities, for example, they never get told which question to answer, right? They do the things that interest them. And if they're a real expert and it's a noob question, don't let somebody who's, not as expert answer that, and they'll devote their attention to the stuff that's, more interesting and engaging and more brand building for them. Many organizations have some kind of a chat room or collaboration space or a Slack or whatever, where, people who are having challenges with an issue and need help can just ask for it. Because intuitively, we as human beings, empathetic human beings, know that it's better for us and better for whomever we're helping if we can, not pass them off. So there's a touch and hold was, I think that phrase was invented by Françoise Tournier, but a long time ago. And, that's been a part of many organizations for a long time. So what swarming does is to take some of these ideas that have been floating around, formalize them, and say there's room for technology to help this as well, right? To help match work with the people who are best prepared to do the work.
And how have your clients basically identified expertise? Because I've never been a huge fan of explicit identification, because people either think they're more of an expert than they are, or they don't realize that they have expertise in certain topics.
Yeah, Dunning-Kruger effect is alive and well, right? So the explicit assignment of expertise in like some kind of matrix or something like that, I think is maybe better than nothing, but it's very brittle. Doing it at a level of specificity where it's really useful for something like swarming requires a lot of work, that, as Greg Oxton says, can be very tedious, right? And as you say, often inaccurate. So we've seen a range of approaches, the most basic of which, there's somebody who's been around 15 years who knows what everybody knows. And he'll be the swarming work allocator, right? That obviously doesn't scale, doesn't, work necessarily in as people are developing their expertise. I think doing this based on implicit cues, using models like machine learning that say, well, hey, if I look at the last, cases over the last 6 months that such and so has been working on, And I've look at those cases that have gotten, good feedback scores. And if I look at the knowledge base articles they've been writing and the knowledge base articles they've been using, I can get a sense of whether they're a good candidate to be looking at this case or not. Now,
Yeah.
ultimately, this is where it's really important that you're not assigning this case because maybe the machine learning algorithm got it wrong. And also you need to be able to say what I'm interested in learning as well as what I'm already good at, right? So
Yeah.
there will tend to be a blend, but and again, that's why the opt-in is so important. But using technology for that watches how people actually do the work as well as what they're interested in and what they volunteer to do, I think is ultimately, a skills matrix that's manually maintained is just not gonna
Yeah.
work.
Okay. Because one of the things I've just been, I guess, frustrated by is, I think it was back in 2008, and I was trying to find the date, but I'll link to it in the YouTube video. Evergence, the consulting company I was working for at the time, we actually got, I think it was like the Innovators Award or something like that at TSIA for, we were talking about the same thing, right? Like, how do you identify expertise, and how do you be that sort of traffic cop or whatever that's monitoring all the interactions that are going on throughout the enterprise? And we were trying to put together sort of this open source stack where we could basically see, going back to some of your examples, okay, for all these cases that Bill, created, we'll give him some points for that. And then maybe he gets a little more points if, the case was closed quickly or whatever. There was all these different models on sort of transactional types of processes that Bill or Sally or whoever might be going through. And then there were the forum threads. Like if you're even reading a forum thread, then you're gaining some level of expertise versus posting to it versus posting the reply that was marked as the solved answer. And then there was even this concept of email traffic, right? Like if you're copied on an email, because we all know everybody's copied on too many emails, setting the joke aside, including myself, that, I might not read that email, but generally either people have assumed you should be in the know on this, or you're scanning through the email and getting some information. And so I've only been able to do it a couple times because that project was killed when Kana acquired that consulting company. But a couple times I've been able to leverage the search engine, for my client to basically do all that, because in the index we have all this, these actions, right? And then we can pair that with, some sort of scoring algorithm, and then query the search engine not to get a list of knowledge results. Maybe it is, maybe it's the know-how and the know-who, but in many cases it's, tell me who I should assign this issue to. And we come back and say, well, Bill's worked the most amount of cases in the organization. He's also been on some of these forum threads and that sort of thing. And it's amazing. I did this with an engineering company, meaning like construction types of projects, that sort of thing. And it was just amazing to see who were the real experts versus who thought they were the experts. And in so many cases, it was sort of like that long tail content thing. My client would be spinning up a project that's unusual for them. Maybe it's they don't do a lot of work in China, so they don't know off the top of their hand all the regulatory stuff over there. Or maybe it's a certain type of bridge that isn't built every day. But gosh, finding Bill and Sally, who were about to retire, I'm using an extreme example. We're going to retire next month, but maybe we convince them to stay on for this project. And then in combination with that, you pull in, the know-how as far as, oh, by the way, the margin wasn't great on that project because we only had 2 people who knew anything about this. And so it's just very interesting to me. And so as I go to all these intelligent swarming webinars and so forth, I hear a lot of talk about what it is and what it can be, but I wish more technology vendors would have more solutions on either being that identifier, or at least making their data available to, some sort of other tool that somebody wants to make, even if it's a Google Doc, right? To just feed information into this thing, and then you could create those algorithms in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and I think again, having machine learning go after this is really valuable, because
Yeah.
trying to handcraft like what any of us would have been stuck with back in the emergence days of coming up with business rules for this kind of stuff and
Yeah.
points values and stuff is difficult. But watching and providing feedback to an algorithm, like you exposed these kinds of issues to these 4 people, and one of them never picked up any of them, and one of them picked up a lot of them. So
Yeah.
what can we learn from that? I think is really valuable. Another thing that can't be lost in here is the importance of measures. So we were talking about people in self-service, migrating from just deflection to overall, success and customer value. The same thing's happening here. If we have the smartest engine in the world to expose issues to the right people, and whether it's a new case coming in or a request for help that's come in from an existing case, if we have the smartest thing in the world and then measure everybody individually on their case numbers,
Yeah.
we will have completely destroyed our ability to do this. In an assessment many years ago, I was talking with a young engineer who said, I'm the only person in the team who is certified on some 4-letter acronym, a networking thing. And so he said, by rights, I really ought to take all those issues, because I'm more capable of doing it than my colleagues. He said, on the other hand, they tend on average to take about 3 times as long as a normal issue. So I make sure never to take more than 1 a week.
Yeah.
And the angels wept, right? And by the way, having talked to his manager, he wasn't wrong in doing that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you've got people deliberately sub-optimizing the performance of the team to keep their own numbers okay, right? And so just going back to Agile, we don't have individual, how many thousands of lines of code did Mary write this week, right? We have velocity of the team. And I think, that's in a swarming environment, you really need to think like that, or you've shot yourself in the foot before you've deployed any technology or process change.
Yeah, great point. So last question, then I'll let you go. What's the biggest thing you've changed your mind about in knowledge management? It could be recent, or it could be, over the whole time.
Well, that's a fantastic question. I think that I was deeply cynical about wikis and chatbots as technology solutions. And although I still believe that chatbots as a technology are oversold, there is no denying that people have had very successful knowledge programs with Confluence and other wikis, and there's no denying that chatbots have really delivered numbers in the real world. So I think that's an area where changing my mind about is a very polite way of saying I was just wrong.
Yeah. Well, I'm still wrong about the chatbot thing, I guess, because I still don't see it, but
yeah, I wish people were more realistic about saying that in most cases, really what we're doing is optimizing for certain happy paths.
Yeah.
And rather than, this machine intelligence is going to sit there and, okay, so, we're in an era where ChatGPT just came out, right? So maybe I have to walk some of that back, but the chatbots that I see deployed in my client base and in the industry are not ChatGPT by a long shot. The other thing I think is that when I got involved in KCS, I think just because of who we are and who we hung out with, I was really fixated on technical support, like mostly high complexity B2B technical support. And I spent a lot of my life still doing that, and it's a great fit. What I think I've changed my mind about is the applicability of these processes, right? That KCS ideas, while they're not written in a way that talks about general purpose enterprise knowledge management, those principles can go a long way in doing a better job of that. And I know there will be some wonderful KM World presentations about that coming up, so I will be happy to go back. There are going to be, we've seen such success in HR, in sales or solutions engineering, in customer success, in legal, in procure to pay, right? Just any time that people are getting asked questions and they're answering them, KCS is a pretty much a dead-on fit.
Yeah.
And in cases where that's not working, like this very advanced research and development group that I'm working with, the ideas still all work. You just need to think a little bit creatively about how to map it onto the processes that are happening here. But we still can integrate knowledge into people's jobs and not have it be a separate thing. Because as a separate thing, it's never going to happen.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it's funny because a while back, I had pinged you with kind of a funny thing of like, if the vendor's not going to put it on their website, I'm going to put it on mine. Like, I'm just part of the community. We've got to document the knowledge. And now, everybody can feel sorry for my spouse because I've got, like a OneNote thing that it's like various things ranging from how do we configure, the TVs in the house or whatever. I'm like, no, we're not going to just discuss this every time. We're going to document it. And even if my 13-year-old son finds a new way of doing it, he's going to go in and update that. So that's the joy that my wife has living with the engineer / KCS guy. But I mean, it's applicable to so many aspects of life. Well, yeah, well, I'm still waiting for my, perfect chatbot experience to happen where I changed my mind. But I really appreciate the time today, David. And I've learned a lot, and I know that others will too. So thank you so much.
Really appreciate, always great to have the opportunity to have a conversation with you. And yeah, I do need to run because the FAQ I've written for the new stereo system we got needs updating. So thanks very much.
And I'll link in the video to your website so people can see a little bit more about your consulting practice. So
awesome.
Thank you.
Love to talk to you. Thanks. Bye.